A quiet afternoon in a peaceful neighborhood, or so it seems, until two reckless officers make the worst mistake of their careers. They target a young black boy for no reason right in front of his father, without realizing who that father is. Because he's not just any man, he's a decorated legend in special forces, trained to overcome chaos, protect the innocent, and bring justice where justice fails. What unfolds next is not just about karma, it's about consequence, legacy, and the kind of strength you never see coming until it's too late. This story will grip your heart, shake your spirit, and remind you that sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's warning. Before we dive in, let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of justice unfolding. It was the kind of morning that slipped in quietly, wrapped in the hush of a small town, still half asleep, where the mist clung gently to the rooftops, and the sunlight hadn't yet made up its mind about showing up. Elijah Reed stood barefoot on the dew-covered driveway of his modest two-bedroom home in Salem, Oregon, a faded maroon pickup truck parked beside him and a bucket of soapy water in one hand. The scent of wet grass mingled with the sharp tang of car wax as his 13-year-old son Jacob scrambled out the front door, dragging the hose behind him like a reluctant dog on a leash. "You could have waited, Dad," the boy mumbled, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Elijah didn't look up right away. He just smiled and said, "The truck waits for no one, kiddo." Their house wasn't much, but it was theirs, bought in full the day Elijah retired from service-traded combat boots for mechanic's gloves, and vowed never to raise his voice again unless it was for laughter or love. He had built a life out of quiet routines, waking early, making breakfast, walking Jacob to the bus stop, fixing engines that made more sense than people ever did. The walls of that home had seen little luxury, but held more peace than most mansions could promise. The screen door creaked behind them as Jacob darted back in for a towel, his footsteps, a familiar rhythm, his presence, a daily reminder of everything Elijah had once fought to protect. The morning moved with gentle ease. Birds called from the old oak tree that stretched its limbs over half the driveway, casting shifting shadows across the cracked concrete. Jacob sprayed water at the rear fender and let out a sharp laugh when it splashed back at him. Elijah chuckled low in his chest and reached for the sponge. "That's physics for you," he said, and Jacob rolled his eyes. "Or maybe karma," the boy shot back. There was no rush, no noise, no reason for tension, just the sound of water running, rubber soles squeaking on wet pavement, and the occasional distant bark from a neighbor's backyard. It was a moment so normal, so soft around the edges, that it barely seemed worth remembering. And yet Elijah would come to remember every detail. He had chosen Salem because it was quieter than the places he'd known, quieter than Baghdad, quieter than Kandahar, quieter even than the silence that followed his wife's funeral 5 years earlier. Here people kept their lawns short and their greetings shorter. The neighborhood wasn't hostile, just hesitant, a little too polite, a little too practiced in not making eye contact. Elijah didn't mind. He wasn't looking to be known. What mattered was giving Jacob a chance to grow up somewhere that didn't feel like a battlefield. Somewhere he could still believe in fairness and rules that applied to everyone. Jacob was a wiry kid with a smart mouth and kind eyes, always asking questions that made Elijah pause and think before answering. That morning he wore an oversized t-shirt that hung past his shorts, and he sang off-key as he worked. Elijah watched him carefully from the corner of his eye, noting the way his son moved, careless, in the best way, still unscarred by the need to second-guess every gesture, every word. That innocence felt fragile, like a soap bubble caught in a breeze. "Hey, Dad, you think we'll finish before lunch?" Jacob asked, standing on tiptoe to reach the roof of the truck. Elijah nodded. "Only if you stop soaking yourself and start scrubbing." The boy grinned and sprayed him anyway. A streak of water hit Elijah's shirt, and for a moment he stood frozen, not angry, not startled, just still. Then he wiped his face with his sleeve and laughed low and short, and Jacob laughed louder. There was a sacredness in that silliness, a kind of holiness no prayer could touch. Time slowed. Elijah bent to rinse the sponge, his knees popping gently with age. The sunlight had started to stretch now, creeping over the hedges and warming the back of his neck. Across the street, a garage door groaned open. Someone started a leaf blower. The world was waking up, and for the first time in weeks, Elijah felt something close to okay. Not happy, not content, but okay. That moment, Jacob singing the foam sliding off the truck's hood, Elijah humming along to a song he barely remembered was a snapshot he would later replay in his mind like a photograph gone slightly yellow at the edges. Because in that sliver of time there was no history chasing him, no headlines, no echo of commands shouted through radios. Just a father and son side by side washing away yesterday's dust with water, soap, and small talk. And then just beyond the curve of the street, he heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of tires over gravel. Not rushed, not panicked, just watchful. Elijah's hand paused mid-scrub. He looked up. A white cruiser rolled past the hedgeline windows, tinted, no sirens, no flash, just presence. The kind that wasn't meant to reassure but to observe. He tracked the car's path as it passed by noting the pause, the way the brake lights flickered but didn't stay on. Then it was gone. He said nothing. Jacob hadn't noticed. Elijah dipped the sponge again, pressed it slowly to the hood, and resumed his rhythm. But something had changed. The air, once soft and sunlit, now held a faint tension, barely there, like the buzz of an electric fence just beyond hearing range. He knew that feeling. He'd felt it stepping out of helicopters, walking into unknown villages, passing checkpoints in cities where eyes followed him too closely. But this wasn't Iraq. This was home. And for now the driveway was still theirs. And so he kept scrubbing the water, dripping steadily, the hose hissing low against the concrete, Jacob's voice still singing off-key in the background. Elijah didn't look back, but inside something, ancient and patient, had started to stir. The cruiser came back 10 minutes later, slower this time, hugging the curb as though measuring each square foot of sidewalk, its engine humming low like a question no one wanted to ask. Elijah noticed it first, not the sound but the stillness it left in its wake, the way birds stopped mid-chirp, and the water hose sputtered quietly against concrete now coated in silence. Jacob didn't notice right away, still bent over the front tire, scrubbing a stubborn patch of dried mud, his small hands steady and unaware of the tension slowly blooming around him. Elijah straightened, placed the sponge back in the bucket, and wiped his hands on a worn towel, his eyes following the cruiser's path as it idled just past their mailbox. The windows were too dark to see inside, but he knew that stillness recognized it from years of approaching villages, where intent was wrapped in calm and danger didn't shout it watched. He walked toward the edge of the driveway, not threatening, not inviting, just present, tall, balanced with the quiet posture of someone used to scanning shadows for meaning. Jacob looked up finally, eyes flicking from his father to the police car, then back again, his lips parting as if to ask something but catching the edge of Elijah's expression and choosing silence instead. The cruiser didn't move for a long breath. Then the passenger door opened with a sharp click, and a young officer stepped out, early 30s, maybe pale-faced, hair buzzed too short. The kind of expression that came not from confidence but from instructions followed too, tightly. Behind him the driver exited as well, broader build, older fingers twitching near his belt, his gaze sweeping the yard, not like someone investigating but someone evaluating. "Morning," the first officer said, his tone flat, casual, in a way that felt unnatural, like a smile without eyes behind it. Elijah nodded once, his voice calm even. "Morning, officer. Is something wrong?" The second man spoke before his partner could answer. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area. Said there were 2 individuals tampering with a vehicle." Elijah tilted his head slightly, glancing back at Jacob. Then the truck returned his eyes to the officer. "This is my home," he said. "That's my son. We're washing our truck." The first officer's jaw worked behind clenched teeth. The second stepped forward another pace. "You got ID on you." His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, trimmed of politeness. Elijah kept his tone measured. "It's inside the house. I can get it for you if you'd like." "No need," the older officer said quickly, the edge of suspicion already coloring the moment. "I didn't say you could move." For a second the breeze shifted, and with it something colder entered the space between them. Elijah held still, not because he felt danger, he'd felt far worse, but because he knew what unease looked like behind a badge, and what escalation sounded like before it spoke. He offered a quiet nod, then added, "We haven't done anything wrong. This is our property." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of all the things they wouldn't say. Full of assumption, of projection of the 1,000 moments that had come before, not here on this street, but in cities where men who looked like Elijah had explained their existence to men who didn't believe it. The younger officer shifted his weight, adjusting his stance the way a man does when he's not sure if he's in control. The older one glanced at Jacob and narrowed his eyes. And the boy Elijah didn't answer immediately. He didn't like the way the man said it, not the question itself, but the way he separated his son from him with just a single word. "He's my son," Elijah said, slower now. "His name is Jacob. He's 13. Jacob's mouth was dry, his eyes fixed on the hose still running behind him, water pooling by the front tire. He shifted his foot almost imperceptibly like he wanted to back away but wasn't sure which direction was safe. "Stay where you are." The second officer barked and Jacob froze, his arms stiff at his sides. Elijah raised one hand, palm outward, careful, deliberate. "Please," he said gently. "He's just a kid. He's scared." The officer's hand dropped, lower fingers brushing the black grip of his taser. The world got smaller, then smaller than the driveway, smaller than the space between a father and his son, smaller than breath itself. The air no longer carried birdsong or the smell of wax or even the warmth of the sun. It carried electricity now, unspoken, unspent, hovering like storm clouds that hadn't decided yet whether to break. Elijah's heartbeat remained slow, but something old inside him stirred a calculation, a countdown, a cascade of contingencies. He knew this wasn't yet the moment, but it could be. "Sir," he said, locking eyes with the older man, "this doesn't have to escalate." The officer blinked just once, and in that blink was the decision. He stepped back slightly, radioed something short and indecipherable, then nodded toward his partner. They both turned slowly, walked back to their cruiser without a word. The doors shut, the engine purred, and then they were gone, leaving behind tire marks on the curb and a silence that didn't feel peaceful anymore. Jacob didn't speak for a while. He just stared at the place where they'd been, his shoulders tight, his body trying to process a fear he didn't yet have words for. Elijah walked over, turned off the hose, and placed one hand lightly on Jacob's back. "You okay?" he asked, soft as a whisper. Jacob nodded too quickly. Yeah, I guess." Elijah didn't press him. He just looked up at the sky as if trying to locate whatever had shifted. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if the air would ever feel the same again. It happened so fast, Elijah would later wonder if time had actually moved, or if it had shattered instead, scattering seconds like broken glass across the pavement. One moment he was wringing out a sponge eyes, still tracking the cruiser as it turned the corner, and the next there were footsteps, quick, firm, deliberate, followed by the unmistakable snap of a command barked too loud for a quiet street. "Step away from the vehicle, both of you now." The words landed like a slap against a calm afternoon, cutting through the warm hum of birdsong and hose spray, replacing peace with pressure. Elijah turned slowly, every movement intentional, showing his hands, his spine straight, his breath steady in his chest, even as his pulse began to thrum with memory. Jacob stood motionless near the passenger side sponge, still in hand water dripping from his fingertips, as if even gravity wasn't sure what to do. "He's 13, Elijah said calmly, not because he expected it to matter, but because some truths deserve to be said out loud. "We're just washing the car. It's our car. This is our house." The older officer, Hayes, narrowed his eyes, stepping in closer, his fingers dancing near the taser clipped to his belt as if it itched for an excuse. "Don't talk back," he snapped. "You don't get to tell us what's going on." Jacob looked at his father, then a flicker of something passing through his eyes. Confusion, fear, the beginning of realization that the rules didn't apply the way he thought they did. Elijah took a half step forward, arms still raised, voice lowered to a near whisper. "Please, he's just a kid, officer. Let me explain." But Hayes wasn't listening. His hand moved fast, and before Elijah could shift between them, before he could position his body like a shield, there was the crackle of electricity and a sound no father should ever hear his son screaming, as 50 volts tore through him like a curse. Jacob's body folded in half, then dropped hard spine, first legs twisting underneath him, a wet smack echoing as skin hit cement. The hose kept running, water pooling around the boy's shoes, mixing with soap, with dirt, with something Elijah didn't want to name yet. For a heartbeat the world held still. Even the wind stopped. Then Elijah dropped to his knees with a thud, hands trembling as he reached out, touching his son's shoulder, feeling the twitch of residual voltage beneath skin that had only moments ago been warm with laughter. "Jacob," he said, voice cracking, his breath coming short and sharp like he'd just taken a hit to the chest. "Jacob, can you hear me?" But there was no answer. Just a weak groan, a roll of the eyes that showed more white than iris, and the panicked rise and fall of a ribcage trying to remember how to breathe. Elijah didn't cry. He didn't scream. His training wouldn't let him. But something inside him fractured deep and cold, like a fault line shifting after centuries of pressure. He turned, barely moving, barely thinking, and that's when Officer Warner yanked him back, twisted his arm behind his back, and slammed him chest first against the hood of the truck. The metal was warm, but the gesture was not. It was brutal, practiced impersonal, like restraining a wild dog. "You're interfering with an investigation," Warner muttered, as if that could explain everything, as if calling it protocol made it less obscene. Elijah gasped as the cuffs clicked shut, his face pressed so close to the chrome that he could see his own reflection, a distorted mask of disbelief. "He's a kid," he said again, not yelling, not pleading, just stating a fact as blood rushed to his temples, and the edge of fury teased the edges of his restraint. He didn't do anything. 5 feet away, Jacob lay motionless, one shoe half off his limbs, splayed like a broken puppet, and still neither officer moved to help him. There was no radio call for an ambulance, no concern in their voices. Just smugness, cold bureaucratic smugness, as Warner leaned in and whispered, "Maybe next time you'll think twice before running your mouth." Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had memorized both their faces, the cadence of their voices, the shape of the moment when power chose cruelty over decency. From the houses nearby, curtains shifted, blinds tilted, eyes peeked and quickly retreated. Nobody came outside. Nobody said a word. Elijah saw it, saw the way people looked at him, and looked away how they watched it happen, but chose silence over courage. He saw a man standing in the doorway across the street, arms crossed, face hard, and then gone the door, closing with a soft, cowardly click. And that somehow hurt more than the metal of the cuffs or the bite of gravel under his knees. It wasn't just what the officers did, it was how everyone else allowed it. The squad car door opened behind him. Warner shoved him inside without a word, the plastic seats slick with summer heat and the faint smell of sweat and rubber. Through the tinted window, Elijah watched the paramedics finally arrive. Their movements were fast, clinical, detached. One of them placed a mask over Jacob's face, another checked his vitals, and a third loaded him onto a stretcher with the same urgency used for groceries on a belt. Elijah's stomach clenched. He couldn't move, couldn't help. Couldn't do anything except stare through the thick glass and feel the weight of helplessness settle into his bones like winter. As the door slammed shut, he closed his eyes and exhaled once slow and shallow. He didn't think of war zones or ambushes, or the sound of distant artillery. He thought of the way Jacob laughed when his voice cracked, of the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, of the promise he made at his wife's funeral to protect their son at all costs. And now, cuffed and silenced, he wondered what it meant when protection wasn't enough, when being calm wasn't enough, when being right didn't matter. Outside, the cruiser pulled away from the curb, and Elijah opened his eyes to see his own driveway getting smaller through the rear window. A bucket sat tipped over near the front tire, the sponge half submerged in water now tinged gray. The hose was still unwinding across the pavement, like a snake too tired to move, the nozzle hissing softly forgotten in the grass. And for a long time that's all he could hear, the sound of water running steady, indifferent, as if none of it had happened at all. The street was quiet again, almost too quiet, as if the sound had been sucked out of the neighborhood and replaced with something hollow like shame or cowardice masquerading as peace. The cruiser had long disappeared around the bend, taking Elijah in silence and leaving Jacob behind on a stretcher, his body still, his shoes crooked, one sock halfway down his ankle. A breeze stirred the edge of the spilled bucket, sending ripples across the puddle on the pavement, the water glinting faintly in the sunlight like it didn't just cradle a child's collapse. The neighbors didn't come outside, not really. A few faces peeked through the blinds, some from upstairs windows, one through the crack of a half-open garage door, but none of them moved past their thresholds. No voices called out, no phones recorded, no one asked the boy if he was okay. One woman in a pink bathrobe leaned forward as if to say something, then closed her blinds so quickly the plastic slats snapped against the frame. A man in a muscle shirt stood on his porch for a few seconds, arms crossed, jaw clenched, then turned and went inside without a word. It wasn't just fear that kept them still, it was something older, something heavier, like guilt passed down from generation to generation, now worn like a second skin. It was the kind of silence that came not from shock but from practiced inaction, the kind that had learned long ago to choose comfort over courage. Jacob's hand twitched once on the stretcher, fingers curling slightly, as the paramedics lifted him, their faces neutral, their voices clipped and professional. One of them checked his pulse again, another held the IV steady, and the third called out his vitals to the ambulance driver who barely nodded. The back doors swung open with a dull thud, the kind that made no noise inside a person's chest, but somehow echoed loud enough to leave something cracked. Jacob blinked once slowly, eyes unfocused, lips parted but not speaking. The older paramedic leaned in close and whispered something Elijah would have asked about, something soft and meant to soothe, but no one was left to answer. They loaded him in gently but not lovingly, just enough to do the job. The ambulance doors closed with a final click, and then it too was gone, leaving behind a street that looked almost untouched, as if the morning had simply paused for a moment before returning to normal. The driveway was empty now, except for the bucket, the sponge, and a wet imprint of a boy's body surrounded by footprints that would dry before sunset. The car hood still glistened with soap, the wax left halfway undone, the water hose coiled across the sidewalk like a question no one dared ask aloud. It was all still there, perfectly mundane, perfectly familiar, and yet completely wrong. The neighbors resumed their routines slowly, cautiously, as though nothing had happened. One began mowing his lawn without looking up. Another walked her dog eyes fixed on the opposite side of the street, pretending the wet driveway didn't exist. A teenage boy, who had been watching from the corner, adjusted his earbuds and rode away on his bike. The mailman passed through a half hour later and skipped the Reed mailbox altogether. It wasn't that people didn't know, it was that they didn't want to know too much. Knowing too much meant feeling something. Feeling something meant maybe having to say something. And nobody was ready for that. Inside the cruiser, Elijah didn't speak. His wrists throbbed against the cuffs, his jaw tight, a drop of sweat trailing down his temple despite the cool air from the vents. The officer driving didn't say anything either, just kept his hands at 10 and 2, his gaze locked on the road like there was nothing unusual about arresting a man in his own driveway. Warner sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed the corner of his mouth, twitching occasionally like he was chewing on a thought he didn't dare spit out. Elijah leaned his head back against the seat and stared at the ceiling, watching the lights flicker past through the tinted glass, each one casting momentary shadows across his face like camera shutters catching fragments of a story already spinning out of his control. He thought of Jacob's hands, how they shook when he first learned to hold a wrench, how proud he looked last summer when he finally managed to change the oil on the truck by himself. He thought of the way his boy danced in the living room when no one was watching, earbuds and eyes closed, joy unfiltered. And now Jacob's body was stiff on a stretcher, lips trembling, eyes blank. Elijah didn't cry. Not yet. Not in front of these men, not in the back seat of a cruiser that smelled faintly of vinyl and stale coffee. He pressed his wrists against the edge of the cuffs, not hard enough to cut, just enough to feel something. His breathing stayed slow, controlled each inhale, a small act of defiance, each exhale a refusal to give them more than they'd already taken. He didn't speak because there was nothing to say that they would hear, not truly, not with ears already closed by certainty. At the precinct, no one looked him in the eye. They took his name, his prints, and locked him in a small holding room with a single plastic chair and a flickering overhead light. No one told him where Jacob had gone, whether the boy had spoken, cried, or moved again. No one offered water. No one asked if he needed anything. And Elijah didn't ask, because he knew what this was. He had lived through worse, but never so close to home, never so personal. He sat alone in that room for hours, back straight, eyes forward, hands folded in his lap like a man at attention. He counted the seconds between the buzzing of the fluorescent bulb, memorized the pattern of grime on the floor tiles, and waited not for release but for clarity, not for apology but for resolve. Outside the door, the world carried on. People typed reports, sipped coffee, laughed at jokes unrelated to pain. But inside, Elijah's stillness deepened, not because he was broken, but because something inside him had gone utterly still like water before a storm. And when the door finally opened and someone said, "You're free to go," he stood up slowly, adjusted his sleeves and nodded once. He didn't ask why, he didn't look back. He just stepped out into the hallway and kept walking, one foot in front of the other, through the smell of old paper and sweat and bad decisions, past the bulletin board full of community flyers, past the front desk, where a receptionist didn't even glance up. He walked out the front door into the setting sun where the shadows were long and the street was quiet again, not peaceful, just quiet. And in that quiet, Elijah Reed knew exactly what had been stolen and exactly what he was going to get back. The hospital room was colder than it needed to be, the kind of cold that settled beneath the skin and wrapped itself around the bones, not from the air conditioning vents overhead, but from the sterile quiet that hospitals seem to keep for moments like these, when uncertainty fills the space, louder than machines, louder than breath, louder even than the echo of footsteps in the hallway outside. Elijah sat beside Jacob's bed without moving much, his body still, his hands folded together tightly, resting on his knees like they were trying to keep everything from falling apart. The monitors beeped in calm, indifferent rhythm, each tone a mechanical reassurance that his son's heart still beat, that the worst hadn't happened, though it had come close enough to change everything. Jacob lay still beneath the thin white blanket, a small tube taped to his arm, and sensors stuck across his chest. His lips dry and slightly parted, the corners of his mouth twitching occasionally, like he was chasing a word he couldn't quite form. His eyes fluttered every now and then, not fully open, not fully gone, just caught in a space between fear and fatigue, and it broke something in Elijah every time. He leaned forward once, gently brushing a hand across his son's damp hair, then sat back again as if moving too much might disturb the fragile thread that still connected them. Outside the window, the sun had already slipped behind the horizon, turning the clouds a faint copper color, but inside the room the light was flat and unforgiving, flashing across linoleum floors, reflecting against steel fixtures, and turning even the warmest faces into shadows. Nurses came and went, some offering quiet nods, others avoiding Elijah's eyes altogether. No one said much. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they didn't know how to say it to a man who had once stitched wounds in war zones and now sat helplessly watching his own son recover from an act of violence on American soil. Elijah hadn't left Jacob's side. Not for food, not for sleep, not for a single breath outside the hospital walls. He'd watched every IV be changed, every chart be checked, every polite update filtered through a lens of professional detachment. And through it all, the question never left him why a boy with a sponge in his hand and soap on his shirt could be seen as a threat. He had faced enemies with rifles and grenades and tactical skill, but never once had he felt this kind of helplessness, this slow, burning rage that didn't know where to go. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Elijah turned slowly, not startled, just tired, and saw a nurse peek her head in with an apologetic look in her eyes. "There's someone here to see you," she said softly. "Says he's from Internal Affairs." Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked at Jacob again, then stood without a word, adjusted the sleeves of his shirt, and followed the nurse out into the hallway. The man waiting there was mid-40s, slightly overweight, with a receding hairline and a badge clipped discreetly to his belt. He held a notepad in one hand and extended the other out politely. "Detective Hanley," he said. "I'm reviewing the incident involving your son." Elijah looked at the hand, didn't take it. Hanley cleared his throat awkwardly and lowered it. "I've seen your record," he added, voice more cautious now. "Special Forces, right?" Elijah didn't respond. He just stared unmoved, letting the weight of silence make the man uncomfortable. Hanley tried again, this time with a practiced tone. "Look, I'm not here to excuse anything. What happened was bad. But we've got procedures. Before anyone gets disciplined, we need reports, statements, chain of events. I just need your version of what took place." Elijah's voice was low when it came controlled and unhurried. "You'll get it in writing," he said, "through my lawyer. I won't be answering anything else without counsel present." Hanley nodded quickly. "Of course. That's your right." He tried to soften the moment with something like encouragement. "I think you're doing the right thing, staying calm. That'll help your case." Elijah met his eyes, and for a moment the hallway felt 10 degrees colder. "This isn't a case," he said. "This is my son." Then he turned, walked back into the room, and shut the door behind him without looking back. Jacob stirred an hour later, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes squinting against the dim light. Elijah leaned in, fast heart clenching. "Hey," he said gently, "I'm here. You're safe." Jacob blinked slowly. "What happened?" Elijah swallowed hard. "You passed out, buddy. You're okay now. You're in the hospital, but you're okay." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, then murmured, "Did I do something wrong?" The words hit harder than any taser ever could. Elijah shook his head slowly, the ache behind his eyes tightening. "No," he said firmly, placing a hand over Jacob's. "You didn't do anything wrong. Not one thing." Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed. Radios played. People made dinner. But inside that room, time moved differently, each minute heavy with questions and memories that hadn't finished forming. Elijah stayed, seated, the fluorescent lights humming above him, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor, and with every beep of the heart monitor, he reminded himself that his son was still here, still breathing, still with him. And yet something inside Elijah had shifted. Not broken, something sharper, something older. Not fury, not grief, but a clarity that came from having nothing left to misunderstand. He'd lived through combat, survived foreign battlefields, but what had happened on his front lawn wasn't a mistake. It was a message. And now he knew what had to be done. He wasn't a man who raised his voice, but he knew how to be heard. Not through chaos, but with precision. As the night deepened and the hallway lights dimmed, Elijah leaned back in his chair, still holding Jacob's hand. His eyes remained open, alert, watching the pulse in the boy's wrist, as if guarding the beat itself. He didn't know how long they'd stay in that room or what tomorrow would look like. But one thing was certain. They'd taken their shot and missed. And that meant Elijah still had the most dangerous thing a man like him could ever possess: time, purpose, and a reason that couldn't be negotiated. The beeping of the monitor continued. The world beyond the hospital walls might have been sleeping, but Elijah Reed was wide awake. The night after Jacob came home from the hospital was heavy in a way Elijah hadn't felt since his last deployment, the kind of heaviness that didn't come from fatigue, but from the weight of knowing too much and not being able to forget any of it. The house was quiet, too quiet, and every familiar sound, the ticking of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even the creak of the wooden floors under his boots, felt like it belonged to a different life, one that no longer fit the blank shape of the man standing inside it. Jacob was sleeping upstairs finally, after hours of tossing, after flinching at every distant siren, after asking questions his father couldn't answer without choking on his own silence. Elijah had stood outside his son's bedroom door for almost 30 minutes after the boy drifted off, just watching the slow rise and fall of his chest in the half-dark, making sure it stayed steady. Downstairs, the air was colder than it should have been, though the heat was set to 70, and the living room held the scent of stale coffee, leather, and tension that had nowhere to go. Elijah sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white, staring at nothing but the edge of the coffee table, where Jacob's notebook still sat open with a single sentence, half finished in pencil. He reached for it once, then stopped, like touching it might smudge something more fragile than ink. The television was off, the windows shut tight, and the front porch light still flickered every few seconds, a problem he'd meant to fix last week before everything fell apart. Somewhere deep in the house, the water heater kicked on, and for a moment it reminded him of a distant generator from his old forward operating base, the sound transporting him back to nights where survival was measured by silence and instinct. He hadn't needed those instincts in years, but now they were waking up: muscle memory, emotional memory, something ancient and sharp. He rose slowly, bones aching from more than just time, and crossed to the hallway closet. He reached into the back past winter coats and a toolbox that hadn't been touched since spring, and pulled out an old metal case battered at the corners and sealed tight with clasps that hadn't clicked open in almost a decade. The case was military-issue olive green, the kind you don't keep unless you've earned the right to. Elijah set it gently on the kitchen table, his breath held between clenched teeth, and opened it without ceremony. Inside were memories pressed into steel and nylon, dog tags, folded letters, laminated mission briefings, a compass worn smooth along the edges, and one photograph that had never left his side until he came back home for good. In the photo, 5 men stood in desert fatigues, squinting into the sun, their faces dirt-streaked and grinning, the kind of grin you only wear when you've survived something no one back home will ever understand. Elijah didn't smile at the picture. He just nodded once and set it aside. Beneath it all, wrapped in cloth, was a notebook, not tactical, not official, just his, filled with names, numbers, codes, and contact points. It wasn't that he'd planned for this. It was that some part of him had always known peace was temporary, that silence only lasted until the next man with a badge decided to rewrite the rules. He flipped through the pages slowly, not rushing, scanning the entries like a man checking the wind before lighting a match. Some names were scratched out, gone, moved on, buried, but some weren't, and those were the ones he needed now. He sat again, this time with the notebook open, and a burner phone beside it, one he kept in a drawer for emergencies that he used to joke would never come, but they had, and he wasn't laughing now. He scrolled through the numbers, paused at one labeled, "Only Ramona." Risk. and hit call. The line rang once, twice. Then, a click. "Who gave you this number?" came the voice, sharp, female, and immediately on edge. Elijah didn't answer the question. He just said her name. "Ramona. It's me." A pause. Then the sound of breath tightening on the other end. "Elijah," she said. "Jesus. I thought you were dead." "Not yet," he replied, the corner of his mouth twitching into something not quite a smile. "But they came for my boy." He didn't tell her everything. He didn't need to. She knew him well enough to hear what he didn't say. "I need information," he continued. "I need to know who they are, what they've done before, and I need to do this right, quiet, legal, surgical." Ramona sighed, a sound that carried more than just fatigue, it carried history. "You still have the channels?" she asked. "Some," he said. "The rest I'll rebuild." When the call ended, Elijah sat back and stared at the ceiling, the weight of his decision settling into his chest like armor. He wasn't returning to war, not in the conventional sense, but something inside him had shifted into position. There were rules to this kind of fight, ones he knew by heart. It wasn't about rage or retaliation. It was about control, about gathering, watching, documenting, and then striking where it counted most, with evidence, with precision, with the kind of weight only truth could carry. Later that night he made another call, this time to someone further off the grid, someone he hadn't spoken to since the day they pulled a fellow soldier from enemy territory under fire. "Trevor," he said when the voice answered. "I need eyes." Trevor didn't ask why. He didn't need to. "You got 48 hours, he said. "Give me everything you got." Elijah hung up and looked back at the stairs where the soft glow of a nightlight spilled across the top landing. Jacob was safe for now. But safety wasn't a guarantee. It was a discipline, a promise, a line drawn in the sand and held no matter the cost. And so, as the clock ticked past midnight, Elijah Reed sat in the heart of a home that no longer felt quite the same, surrounded by the echoes of his past and the urgency of what lay ahead, not seeking vengeance, not craving attention. But with one clear truth carved into the center of his being: they had made a mistake. Not just by hurting his son, but by assuming the man behind the silence didn't remember how to fight. And now, piece by piece, he was getting ready. Not to burn it all down, but to dismantle it from the inside. The first name he called wasn't someone from the military, not officially anyway, but someone whose silence had once saved 6 lives in an alleyway no map ever marked. Ramona Vega had been a data analyst buried deep in a federal counterintelligence cell, but she moved like someone who'd seen real damage and understood that war didn't always wear a uniform. Her voice, when she picked up, was sharp but clear. No greetings, no questions, just 3 words: "Tell me everything." Elijah didn't rush. He spoke slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when each word is a measured step, not a plea, but a strategy. He told her what happened on the driveway, what they did to Jacob, what they didn't say, and what the silence afterward meant more than any report ever could. Ramona didn't interrupt. She listened like a professional and responded like a friend. "Give me 3 days, she said. "I'll see what surfaces." Then she paused, softer now. "You ready to go full circle?" Elijah let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "I was ready the moment he hit the ground," he replied. The second name he reached for required more than a call. It needed a knock on a door, a drive 2 hours west into a town where sunlight felt suspicious, and trust was a currency no one carried in large amounts. Preston Lowe had once been a military lawyer who stepped away from the system when it demanded too much compromise. Now he ran a small civil rights legal office out of an old converted firehouse, surrounded by files no one dared to lose, and a staff of 3 who all looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. Preston answered the door himself, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp under thick-rimmed glasses. "You bring trouble," he said with a grin, and Elijah responded with a nod. "It found me first." Inside, they sat at a metal desk, cluttered with documents, a coffee pot that had seen better days, and a pair of dusty law books still bookmarked with yellow post-its. Elijah laid out the situation not from anger but with clarity, like stacking evidence on a table for someone who already knew how the pieces fit. Preston didn't take notes right away. He just leaned back, tapping a pen against his chin, letting the story settle like dust in an empty courtroom. "This isn't just about the taser," he finally said. "This is about precedent. About history, about patterns they thought no one would ever trace." Elijah nodded once. Then let's trace them. That same night, Elijah returned home with a folder under his arm and a different weight in his chest. Not dread, not rage, but something more focused, more surgical. The lights in Jacob's room were off, but he peeked in anyway, watching for that steady breath in the dark. Downstairs, he turned on only one lamp and sat at the kitchen table, flipping open the file Preston had given him. Names, case numbers, internal reports that never made it to the public, redacted paragraphs, and sealed outcomes. But patterns loud enough for anyone who dared to listen. He didn't sleep. He read. He circled names. He highlighted dates. He connected events across years, across different departments, across districts. And as dawn crept in with a light too gentle for the work in front of him, he made his first list, not of enemies, not of targets, but of doors. Doors he would knock on, doors he would open, doors they thought were locked. The next day, Ramona called back. Her voice was low, firm, but laced with something like disbelief. "You were right," she said. "They've got a system." She sent encrypted files over a private link files, showing informal quotas passed around in internal memos, emails marked with phrases like "keep presence strong" and "increase visibility in certain zones." It wasn't overt. It never is. But it was enough. Enough to show that Jacob wasn't a mistake. He was a statistic in motion. A number on a monthly report. A stop that was supposed to look routine but was loaded before it began. Elijah forwarded the documents to Preston, then closed his laptop and sat in the silence for a long moment. Outside, a school bus rumbled past, and for a second he imagined what it would have been like if that day had gone differently, if it had ended with laughter and a dry towel, instead of a stretcher and handcuffs. He didn't linger on it. Regret had its place, but not here. Not now. That afternoon he made the third call to someone he never expected to ask for help again. Adrian Blake had been his adversary once in a courtroom, where the stakes were high and the truth was inconvenient. But she'd earned his respect, not by winning but by refusing to back down when justice demanded more than procedure. She answered on the third ring, her voice clipped professional but not cold. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I've been expecting this." Elijah laid out everything, what he had, what he needed, and how far he was willing to go without crossing the line that divided justice from retaliation. Adrian didn't flinch. "You've got enough for a federal motion," she said. "If we file it right, we can shift jurisdiction." Elijah exhaled. Not relief exactly, but confirmation. "Then we file." That evening the house was quiet again, but different than before. Not the fragile quiet of fear, but the deliberate quiet of preparation. The kind of quiet that meant someone was thinking, someone was planning, and someone was finally watching back. Elijah sat in his garage, the door halfway open, his phone beside him, the old military case now empty on the workbench behind him. He was no longer a soldier, not in uniform, not on paper, but the discipline, the structure, the instinct, it never left. As the light faded and the air cooled, Jacob came out rubbing his eyes and dragging a blanket behind him. "Dad," he asked softly, "are we going to be okay?" Elijah looked at him, took a deep breath, and nodded. "We're not just going to be okay," he said. "We're going to make it right." Jacob didn't say anything, just leaned against his father's shoulder, and together they sat there, not speaking, letting the weight of everything settle into something both heavy and certain. Because Elijah knew that in war you don't always get to choose the battlefield. But you do get to choose how you fight. And now, with names in hand and truth on his side, he was preparing to fight in the only way he knew how, with calm, with precision, and with the full weight of everything they never saw coming. It started with a 15-second video, grainy and shaky, filmed from behind a curtain by a teenager whose bedroom window faced Elijah's driveway. The boy hadn't meant to record anything that morning. He just heard shouting, thought it was nothing, then saw a child's body drop to the ground like it had been struck by lightning limbs, convulsing eyes, wide mouth open in silent shock. The video didn't show the taser being fired, but it captured the moment Jacob fell, and the scream that followed, raw, unfiltered, unshakable, cut through the background noise like glass breaking inside your chest. It captured Elijah shouting his son's name, his voice splitting at the seams with disbelief, and it captured the officers' postures, rigid, still unmoved like statues carved out of arrogance. The boy who filmed it uploaded it that night, not expecting much, just a way to share what he saw, maybe hoping someone would believe him before the official story took shape. But within hours the video had been reposted 100 times, then 1,000, and by morning it had spread like wildfire across social media, local blogs, and eventually into the inboxes of people who still cared about truth more than damage. Control. Elijah didn't even know it existed until Preston called him, his voice calm but laced with something urgent. "You need to see this," he said. "It's already out there." Elijah sat at the kitchen table, Jacob asleep upstairs with a cool cloth on his forehead, the house still dim with early light. He watched the video once, then again, then a third time. Each time he felt his breath tighten, not with anger but with a kind of mournful recognition this was no longer just his memory. It had become a public archive. He noticed the details no one else would, the way Jacob's knees buckled, the slight hesitation in the officer's step afterward, the angle of the sun casting both their shadows long across the driveway. He saw it for what it was, and he also saw what it would become. "They can't bury it now," Preston said over speakerphone, "not with this in the open." Elijah nodded slowly, fingers tapping against the table, eyes still fixed on the frozen frame of Jacob lying on the pavement. "No," he said quietly. "But they'll try to explain it anyway. They'll say it was protocol. They'll say he reached for something. They'll say I was resisting." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, the weight of predictions settling over him like armor. "I need to move faster." The next 48 hours moved in waves. First came the local news trucks, small vans with satellite dishes, and overly cheerful reporters who asked permission to just get a quote. Elijah declined them all, watching from behind closed blinds as they packed up and moved on. Then came the statements, first from the police department, full of phrases like pending investigation and procedural review. Then from the mayor's office offering sympathy while stopping short of admitting anything. The words were polished, rehearsed, carefully, chosen not to offend, not to admit, not to feel. Preston handled the interviews, answering questions with the precision of a man who knew exactly what not to say. Adrian joined in as legal counsel, her tone colder but more cutting, wielding facts like scalpels, slicing through speculation with calm authority. Elijah stayed out of the spotlight, not out of fear, but by choice. He knew when to speak, and more importantly, when silence carried more weight. Behind the scenes, Ramona worked in shadows, pulling threads that connected dots no one had dared to link. She uncovered additional footage, surveillance from a neighbor's smart doorbell audio, from an open police radio channel, even metadata buried inside the Taser's deployment log. Each piece painted the same picture with sharper edges. Jacob had been tased without warning, without reason, and with complete disregard for what his body might do once it hit the pavement. It was undeniable. And yet denial would still come. Elijah began to document everything, not just the incident, but the aftermath: conversations, voicemails, the way the neighbors avoided eye contact, the way 2 officers drove past his house twice each day without stopping. He wrote down details, time-stamped events, recorded phone calls. Not because he was paranoid, but because he knew how systems worked, how stories shifted when memories got tired, how facts blurred when power decided it was time to move on. He wasn't going to let them move on. Not this time. One afternoon, as he sorted through copies of the reports Preston had gathered, Jacob wandered downstairs, quieter than usual, his steps light, his shoulders tense. "Dad," he said, standing in the doorway, "why is everyone talking about us?" Elijah looked up slowly, meeting his son's eyes, then gestured to the chair beside him. Jacob sat, fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, eyes cast downward. "They keep saying you're gonna sue the cops," he murmured. "Or go on television. Or fight them somehow." Elijah watched him for a moment, then said gently, "What do you think I should do?" Jacob shrugged, then looked up, his voice, smaller now. "I just want it to go away." Elijah nodded. "I know, but it won't, not by itself. And if we don't speak up, they get to tell the story." Jacob didn't respond, but his lips tightened and something shifted in his eyes. Not agreement, but understanding, maybe the beginning of resolve. That night, Elijah stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a plate, watching the street lamp flicker outside. The window's reflection caught his own face, older than it used to be, harder in some ways, but clearer too. Behind him, the house was still the kind of stillness that came when people were trying to heal quietly. He dried the plate, placed it in the rack, and exhaled. The truth was out there now, in pixels and headlines and inboxes across the country. And though it wasn't the whole story, not yet, it was enough to make the silence crack, enough to make them watch. He didn't need to shout. He just had to keep showing them what they didn't want to see. And if that meant exposing every lie one frame at a time, then so be it. He turned off the kitchen light and stood for a long moment in the dark, hands resting on the counter, the air around him heavy but still. The world was beginning to listen, not because he raised his voice, but because he refused to lower it. And in that quiet certainty, Elijah knew this wasn't just about his son anymore. It was about who gets to tell the story and who finally gets to be believed. The message came just after sunrise, simple and unassuming, a single text on Elijah's secured phone that read, "Done. Sending now." He had been awake for over an hour, already sitting at the dining table with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, the steam replaced by stillness, his hands resting on either side of a thick folder labeled in black Sharpie, "Initial. Evidence. Prior complaints." The light through the blinds cast long stripes across the table, cutting across documents, sticky notes, and newspaper clippings that painted a picture most people refused to see until it was framed in loss. He tapped the screen, opened the encrypted file, and began to read through what Trevor had gathered, each line heavier than the last, each discovery confirming what he already knew in his gut but now held in his hands like cold iron. Both officers, Hayes and Warner, had prior complaints, and not just once or twice, but multiple reports filed over the last 6 years, some sealed under department review, others dismissed with language that spoke louder in what it refused to acknowledge. One had been suspended briefly for an excessive force incident involving a black teenager near a school bus stop. Details, vague witness statements, never followed up. The other had a civil case settled quietly out of court, buried under paperwork and non-disclosure agreements, as if money could erase the bruise from someone else's memory. Elijah leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, eyes closed as he let it all settle into place, not with shock but with clarity. He thought of Jacob asleep upstairs, the soft rustle of blankets still audible through the vent, and he pictured his son's face in that moment on the driveway. The confusion, the pain, the betrayal that hadn't come from strangers, but from the very people who were paid to protect. Elijah opened his eyes and reached for the phone again, pressing a number he hadn't used in years. One he'd kept not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. It rang twice before a voice answered, low and cautious. "Yeah." Elijah didn't waste time. "I need your help. It's time." There was a pause, then a breath. "Tell me what you've got," the voice said, and Elijah did everything straight through without flinching. By noon, Adrian was back in his living room this time, without preamble, dropping her briefcase on the table with a thud that matched the look in her eyes, focused, impatient, and wholly unconcerned with how uncomfortable the truth might make the city feel. "If we file with this," she said, flipping open a document, "we'll have a solid basis for federal jurisdiction. DOJ oversight. Maybe even a special tribunal." Elijah nodded once, saying nothing, but his silence was an answer in itself. Adrian glanced up, her voice more measured. "You sure about this? It's going to get louder. Messier. They're going to dig, smear, deflect." Elijah leaned forward, folding his hands. "Then they'll find exactly what I've chosen for them to see." They worked late into the afternoon cross-referencing documents, organizing the chain of custody for digital evidence, and mapping out the legal framework that would allow a shift from local justice, often performative, too often political, into the hands of those with the power to hold institutions accountable. Preston joined them by video call, chiming in with key language precedent cases, statutes rarely used but never forgotten. And all the while, Elijah kept his mind focused not on vengeance, but on the goal he'd had since the moment Jacob hit the pavement. The truth, undeniable, irreversible, and loud enough to break through the noise of excuses. At some point, Jacob came downstairs, still in pajama pants, his eyes puffy from sleep, his steps tentative, like someone walking into a room he didn't quite recognize anymore. He looked at the files spread across the table, at Adrian typing fast, at Preston's voice coming from the laptop speaker, and finally at his father, who paused and turned toward him. "Hey," Elijah said, softer now. "You hungry?" Jacob hesitated, then shrugged. "A little." Elijah nodded toward the kitchen. "There's soup on the stove." Jacob didn't move right away. His eyes flicked back to the paperwork, the photos, the redacted reports, and he asked quietly, "Is that about me?" Elijah held his gaze. "No," he said gently, "it's about them. And what they've done to people like you for too long." That night, after the legal team left and the house settled again into its quiet rhythm, Elijah sat in the living room with a pen in his hand and a notebook open across his lap. He wasn't writing strategy now. He was writing questions, ones the public would soon be asking once this case reached the level it deserved. How long had they been protecting these officers, who had signed off on their promotions? Why were complaints erased instead of investigated? And most importantly, what happens next when silence no longer works? He closed the notebook, leaned back into the worn cushion of the couch, and let his head rest against the backrest eyes, tracing the cracks in the ceiling he'd meant to patch last summer. The house felt smaller, somehow not in a bad way, but in the way a home feels when its walls are finally holding something that matters. Purpose, truth, resistance. Not noise, but signal. Not rage, but resolve. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing the trees against the side of the house in a rhythm Elijah barely noticed anymore. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then again, and then stopped. Lights from a neighbor's porch flicked on, casting a faint glow across the front steps, where Jacob had once played with sidewalk chalk and written his name in crooked letters that still faintly stained the concrete. Elijah stood, walked to the window, and looked out, not for danger, not for patrol cars, but for proof that the world was still turning, still watching. And in that quiet, something settled inside him, not peace, not victory, but a readiness that hummed beneath his ribs, because they had built the first bridge. The next step would be crossing it, and Elijah Reed, for all he had lost and all he had carried, was prepared to walk across with both eyes open. The morning of the public forum arrived with a quiet tension that clung to the city like fog on glass, thin, almost invisible, but unmistakably, there humming beneath the sidewalks, trailing behind conversations, lingering in the eyes of those who had seen the footage and found themselves unable to unsee it. Elijah woke early, before the alarm, before the birds, before even the sunrise had pushed back the shadows from his backyard fence. He moved through the house in silence, coffee brewing in a steady drip, the soft clink of the spoon against the ceramic mug somehow louder than it needed to be. Upstairs, Jacob was still asleep, his room dim, the corners filled with soft breathing and unfinished homework, his backpack slumped against the wall like a tired guard. Elijah stood in front of the bathroom mirror for longer than usual, not to admire or adjust, but to look himself square in the eye and ask without words if he was ready to walk into a room full of strangers and turn his pain into evidence. His hands were steady, his suit simple dark blue, pressed the night before, by habit, not vanity. The knot in his tie took 3 tries, and when it finally sat right at his collar, he didn't smile or sigh, he just nodded once and walked back into the hallway like a man heading into weather he already knew by heart. The forum was held at the old municipal building downtown, the one with cracked brick columns and a flag that never quite unfurled right unless the wind hit it just so. As Elijah stepped through the front doors, he noticed how quiet it was. No chants, no protests, no shouting, just the low murmur of people gathering, folding chairs, creaking, someone testing a microphone that squealed briefly before settling into static. Adrian met him at the side entrance, her hair pulled back, her blazer neat, her eyes already scanning the crowd like she was building a map from body language alone. "You good?" she asked. Not soft, not hard, just real. Elijah nodded. "Yeah. I've been ready." They didn't script anything. That was the agreement. No podium. No speeches. Just truth. Direct and unfiltered. Like sunlight through dirty glass. The room was full but not packed. Teachers, parents, veterans, kids in hoodies, a few off-duty officers who stayed near the back, their expressions unreadable. Elijah took his seat near the front legs, still hands folded, breathing measured, while Adrian introduced the session in calm, steady tones. "This is not a court," she said. "This is not a stage. It's a space. And in this space we listen." When she turned to him and gave a small nod, Elijah stood, not rushed, not dramatic, and walked to the front, standing not behind a podium but beside it. The microphone was clipped to a stand that barely reached his chest, so he bent slightly, adjusted it, and then looked at the room without blinking. "My name is Elijah Reed," he said, voice firm but not loud, "and what happened to my son Jacob was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. And today I'm here to talk about that pattern, not just through what we felt, but through what we found." He spoke for 12 minutes without notes, his voice moving like a river, calm at first, then stronger, then deeper, carving through silence with each sentence. He told them about the footage, the buried complaints, the sealed settlements, the emails scrubbed of accountability. He told them what it meant to have your child's body twitch under voltage and still be the one arrested. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. But his voice at one moment did pause, just long enough for everyone in that room to feel the weight in their own lungs. When he finished, he stepped back not to applause, but to silence, the kind of silence that doesn't beg for claps, because it's too busy absorbing what just changed. Adrian opened the floor for questions, but few came. Instead, people stood one by one to share stories of stops that lasted too long, of hands that shook on steering wheels, of names forgotten by the justice system until they were etched into tombstones. A woman in the third row spoke about her brother, a Marine like Elijah, whose PTSD wasn't what killed him. It was the traffic stop that treated him like a threat before a person. A boy, no older than Jacob, asked, "Why are they scared of us before they know us?" And no one in the room had an answer that didn't ache. When the forum ended, Elijah stood outside for a while, his back against the stone wall, his hands in his pockets, watching the people spill onto the sidewalk like a slow-moving wave of quiet urgency. No one shouted, no one marched. But something had shifted, an atmosphere, a tone, a pressure that didn't just come from anger but from recognition. Adrian joined him a few minutes later, sipping from a paper cup, her blazer folded over her arm. "You did more than speak," she said. "You started something." Elijah didn't respond right away. He looked out over the city, the way the buildings glowed in that soft, late-afternoon haze, the way traffic moved, like nothing had changed, even though something had. "I didn't want to start anything," he said finally. "I just wanted to stop what's been allowed for too long." Adrian nodded. "You can't stop it all, Elijah, but you cracked it open. That matters." He watched a young woman help her father into a waiting car, their conversation too far to hear, but the smile on the man's face was clear, tired maybe, but full of something that felt like belief. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to feel the wind on his face and the air in his chest, and when he opened them again, the day had not changed, but the silence inside him had. Not gone, not healed, but different, less like a wound and more like a place where something new could be built. And as he turned to leave, footsteps quiet on concrete, his mind didn't rush ahead to what came next. It stayed right here in this moment where truth had been spoken, not with fire but with clarity, and that in itself was enough to carry forward. The courthouse stood still beneath a low sky, the kind of pale gray that made everything feel quieter than it should have, like the clouds were holding their breath along with everyone else. There was no wind, no birdsong, just the low thrum of nervous conversations and the occasional clack of dress shoes on stone as people filed into the building one by one. Inside, the air was different, not heavy, not tense, but deliberate, like it had been arranged by someone who understood how weight settles in a room even before a single word is spoken. Elijah stepped through the double doors with Adrian by his side, his back straight, his face composed, his eyes scanning but not darting, not flinching. He wore the same suit he had worn to his wife's memorial, not because of grief, but because that suit had already seen what it meant to survive something and keep walking forward anyway. The courtroom wasn't full yet, but the front rows were already occupied by people who had watched the video more times than they could count. People who carried their own stories in their eyes, stories that never made headlines, that never got forums or federal filings or a second look from the people meant to protect them. Elijah took his seat at the plaintiff's table without a word, unfolding his hands, slowly pressing his fingertips together, then resting them on his lap. Adrian leaned over, voice low and steady. "They'll try to bury it under policy," she said. "Don't let that get under your skin." Elijah didn't look at her. He just nodded once. "They can't hide what's already out." The defendants entered next, Officers Hayes and Warner, dressed in civilian clothes, their eyes red from either lack of sleep or legal coaching, flanked by lawyers in sharp gray suits, who moved like chess players 3 moves ahead and already cornered. They didn't look at Elijah. They didn't look at the gallery either. Their eyes stayed down, flickering across paperwork over binders and water bottles, never pausing too long in one place. Elijah watched them for a moment, not with hatred, but with clarity, the way a soldier watches the terrain not for danger, but for what it reveals about how the game is played. Then the judge entered, a tall man with silver hair and a voice that didn't need to rise to demand attention. He called the session to order, his gavel hitting the desk with a firm single strike that echoed longer than it should have. The prosecution began with documentation reports, timelines, policy breaches, but it was when Adrian stood that the temperature in the room truly shifted. She moved calmly, confidently, holding a remote in her hand like a surgeon holding a scalpel. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear but measured, "this is not about one afternoon on one street. This is about a culture of disregard, a pattern of behavior, and a failure of accountability. With a click, the first slide appeared an internal email from 6 months prior, coded language that implied racial profiling without naming it, quotas without quotas, suggestions to increase presence in neighborhoods experiencing shifts in tableau demographic visibility. Another click, another slide, a body cam frame capture showing Jacob mid-fall, arms spread the pavement, rushing up beneath him. No audio needed, just the image, silent and brutal. Adrian turned to the jury. "You don't need an expert to tell you what that boy felt in that moment. You already know." Then came the video, unedited, time-stamped and uninterrupted. The courtroom watched as a child's scream split the morning air, as a father's voice rose in disbelief, as 2 officers stood unmoved, while a body twitched in a driveway that belonged to the boy who lay on it. No music, no narration, just reality framed by pixels and pain. Some people looked away. Others didn't blink. And Elijah, seated with his hands still folded, stared straight ahead, his expression unchanged but his jaw tight with the kind of restraint that takes years to master and a second to lose. When the video ended, there was no need for drama. The silence said enough. Later that day, Elijah took the stand. He walked slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because every step was a statement. The oath was routine. The truth was not. He sat down, adjusted the microphone, and let the room settle before he spoke. "My name is Elijah Reed," he began, "and I have spent most of my adult life knowing what violence looks like. I've seen it up close. I've heard it in languages I didn't speak. I've felt it through walls and across oceans. But I wasn't ready for what it looked like when it came wearing a badge, standing on my lawn, staring at my child like he was something less." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't waver. He described what happened with precision, each movement, each word, each second between the command and the shot. He talked about Jacob's voice as he collapsed, about the silence afterward, about the neighbors who looked but didn't act, and the handcuffs that left marks not just on his wrists but somewhere deeper. "They saw a black father," he said, "and a black boy, and they decided we were a threat before we were ever a family." The defense tried to challenge him. They spoke of officer discretion, situational awareness, rapid judgment calls. But the facts didn't bend and the footage didn't flinch. And Elijah, even when pushed, remained composed like a man who had been trained to tell the truth under pressure and who understood the power of letting silence speak when a lie begs for attention. When he stepped down, the courtroom remained quiet, not from fatigue but from gravity, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what came next. The judge recessed for the day, but the weight lingered hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. Outside, the air had cooled, the sky beginning to clear. As the crowd moved out slowly, conversations soft but urgent. Jacob was waiting by the car, seated in the back seat, legs pulled up, earbuds and eyes on the phone but not really watching. When Elijah opened the door and slid in beside him, Jacob pulled one bud out and looked up. "How'd it go?" he asked. Elijah paused, then answered honestly. "It went where it needed to go." Jacob nodded, then looked away again, not out of disinterest, but because some part of him was trying to protect something still healing inside. As they drove away, neither of them spoke much. The streets were familiar, but different now, like the city had shifted slightly, realigned itself around a wound finally named. And Elijah, with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near his son's shoulder, felt a stillness inside him that wasn't peace, but wasn't chaos either. It was something new, something earned, something steady, and for the first time in a long time that was enough. The verdict came down on a Thursday afternoon, just as the sun had started to shift behind the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors that made everything feel more fragile, more formal, more final. The jury filed in with that same quiet gravity they'd carried for days, their eyes lowered, their expressions unreadable, not cold, but cautious. Like people who understood they were about to change something, maybe not the world, but at least the corner of it that had refused to bend until now. Elijah sat with his hands resting on his thighs, back straight, chest, still a picture of calm, though inside him there was a storm swirling in a circle too tight to name. Adrian didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table, not anxious, but focused, waiting for the rhythm of justice to finally land. The judge asked for the verdict, and the foreman rose, a middle-aged woman in a blue blazer who had not spoken a single word throughout the entire trial until now. Her voice was steady but soft, like she wasn't just reading from a piece of paper, but carrying the collective weight of everyone who had ever sat where Elijah sat now. On the count of violation of federal civil rights under color of law, we find Officer Warner guilty. There was no gasp, no murmur, just stillness, the kind that holds its breath. On the count of use of excessive force against a minor, we find Officer Hayes guilty. Elijah didn't move. He didn't smile or blink or shift in his seat. He just breathed out slow, deep, deliberate, as if letting go of something he'd carried across continents, battlefields, and now courtrooms. The judge nodded, his voice firm. Officers Warner and Hayes are hereby remanded into federal custody, pending sentencing and further review under military oversight. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like an ending, but Elijah knew better. Verdicts don't end anything. They just mark the point where pretending is no longer allowed. Outside the courthouse, the steps were crowded with press, and supporters' signs held high, some shouting in triumph, others weeping with release, but Elijah didn't step into the crowd right away. He waited with Jacob near the side entrance, the boy's hand gripping his tightly, his gaze steady but unsure, like he was still learning what it meant to feel both seen and safe at the same time. "Does this mean it's over?" Jacob asked, his voice barely louder than the breeze. Elijah looked down, his expression softening. "It means they can't say it didn't happen," he said. "And that matters." They walked together down the steps through the flash of cameras and the low hum of microphones being extended toward them like questions waiting to be framed. Elijah said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd already said the most important thing under oath in front of strangers, in front of his son. He had spoken the truth not for headlines, but for history, and now he was content to let the truth stand on its own. Later that evening, back at home, the house was quieter than usual, not heavy, not hollow, just still in a way that felt earned. Jacob sat on the couch with a bowl of cereal in his lap, watching a cartoon he wasn't really following, while Elijah stood by the kitchen window, the glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds, casting slats of shadow across the counter where unopened mail sat in a neat stack. He didn't touch it. He just stood there, listening to the soft rhythm of his son's chewing, the distant hum of passing cars, and the quiet click of the front porch light, finally fixing its own flicker. Adrian had called earlier to say there would be follow-ups, statements, probably interviews, but Elijah had asked for one night, just one, where no one asked him to relive it again. She understood. She always did. And that, more than anything, gave him space to breathe. In the garage, his old military case still sat unopened on the bench, not out of neglect, but out of respect. The tools he had used to build this case to defend his child were now resting too, like a weapon returned to its sheath after it had done its job. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel whole. But he felt something else, something harder to name, something steadier than justice and deeper than relief. Jacob eventually drifted off to sleep on the couch, arms folded across his chest, cereal bowl set empty beside him. Elijah walked over, lifted the boy gently, and carried him upstairs, his body heavier, now not with size but with the invisible weight of what they had walked through together. He tucked him in, pulled the blanket up beneath his chin, and stood at the edge of the bed for a moment, watching the steady rhythm of breath that had once been a question mark on a hospital monitor. Downstairs, the house settled again, and Elijah returned to the kitchen, where the silence was no longer a burden but a companion. He poured himself a glass of water, drank it slowly, and placed the glass in the sink with a kind of reverence, as if every action now deserved to be performed with intention, with gratitude, with memory. He stepped out onto the front porch just past midnight, the air cool, the sky, clear stars stretching out like silent witnesses to what had passed. The neighborhood was asleep, but a single porch light across the street flicked on. A neighbor stood in the doorway, nodded once, then stepped back inside. No words, no gesture, just acknowledgement. And that, too, was something. Elijah leaned against the railing, arms crossed, gaze lifted, and for the first time in a long time he didn't feel like a target. He felt like a presence undeniable, unshakable, rooted. He had told the truth. The system had heard it. And though justice didn't fix everything, it had lit a signal fire that others could follow. And so in that quiet, starlit hour he stood still, not because he was unsure, but because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is simply remain, firm, present, unmoved, unafraid. The days after the verdict didn't unfold like Elijah thought they would. There was no sudden sense of triumph, no overwhelming flood of peace, no celebratory clinking of glasses around a table of friends. Instead, there was a steady return to rhythm, quiet mornings, the hum of the coffee maker, the familiar creak of the back steps when Jacob headed out to school, the subtle shift in the way the neighbors waved just a little longer now, like they finally understood something they hadn't before. Still beneath the surface of that routine, there remained a pulse, low constant, and undeniably present, a sense that something had shifted permanently, even if the world outside hadn't caught up yet. One afternoon, Elijah found himself sitting on the porch, eyes half closed, watching sunlight filter through the trees as it moved slowly across the grass. It was one of those rare moments where everything was still, no distant sirens, no car horns, no helicopters circling overhead, just the occasional chirp of a bird and the low rumble of an air conditioner kicking on down the block. He sipped his coffee, letting the warmth settle into his chest, trying to make peace with the idea that moving forward didn't always mean moving on. Jacob stepped onto the porch quietly, his sneakers barely making a sound against the wood. He had his backpack slung over one shoulder, a basketball tucked under the other arm, and a look on his face that Elijah hadn't seen in a while. Something softer, more open, like a weight had finally been lifted from a place too deep for words. "Coach said I should try out for the spring league," he said, not making eye contact, just watching the ball roll slightly beneath his fingers. Elijah nodded, offering a quiet smile. "You thinking about it?" Jacob shrugged, then looked up. "Yeah. I guess I am. Feels like maybe I can breathe again." They sat in silence for a while, not because there was nothing to say, but because the quiet finally felt safe enough to share. Elijah studied his son's profile, the way his jaw had grown sharper over the past year, the way his eyes still carried shadows even in the light, and felt a pang of something both fierce and gentle all at once. "You know," Elijah said after a pause, "it's okay to be nervous, even if it's something good." Jacob nodded slowly. "I know. I don't want to be the kid from the video forever." That landed heavier than either of them expected, and for a few seconds neither moved. Elijah reached over, placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You won't be," he said. "You're so much more than that moment. And anyone who can't see that well, they don't deserve to be part of your next chapter." A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a paper cup skittering across the sidewalk like a wind-blown memory, and for a second, Elijah's thoughts drifted back to the courtroom, to the static of the speakers, to the way the officers' faces never once reflected regret, only fear of consequence. He let the moment pass without bitterness, without trying to rewrite it in his head. Some things were better left as markers on the map, not anchors on the soul. Later that evening, after Jacob had gone to bed, Elijah sat at the dining table with a notepad in front of him. No legal notes, no outlines, no case files, just a blank page, and the thought of what came next. There had been whispers of advocacy, work of speaking engagements, of joining a committee on policing reform, but none of that felt right just yet. Not because he didn't believe in the fight, but because he knew that part of healing wasn't just about pushing back, it was about rebuilding quietly, patiently, with hands that knew the weight of what had been broken. He jotted down a few ideas, scratched them out, then wrote again, this time slower. It wasn't about public statements anymore, it was about legacy, about what he would leave for his son, not in files or verdicts, but in how he lived each day moving forward. He poured himself a small glass of bourbon, not as a reward but as a ritual, and raised it slightly toward the empty chair across from him, the one where his wife used to sit, always with that look that said she saw more than anyone ever gave her credit for. "Still with me," he whispered the words barely louder than breath, and took a slow sip before setting the glass down gently. Outside, the moon had risen, casting silver shadows across the front yard, illuminating the flag that hung beside the door, not as a symbol of blind allegiance, but as a reminder that true patriotism sometimes meant holding your country accountable with everything you had. As Elijah turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, he passed Jacob's room and paused. The door was cracked slightly, just enough to see his son curled up beneath the covers, one arm tucked under his pillow, breathing slow and steady. For the first time in a long time, Elijah didn't feel the need to stand there long to guard or to grieve. He simply smiled, whispered, "Good night, son," and walked quietly to his own room. And in the dark, with only the soft hum of the house around him, he lay down, not with fear, not with regret, but with the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it, not as victims, not as a headline, but as a family that had already weathered the storm and refused to be moved by anything less than truth. The first morning after everything went public, Elijah stood in his driveway longer than usual, watching the horizon before the sun broke through. The quiet felt different, now less like peace, more like the pause before something else begins. Across the street, a neighbor he barely knew raised a hand slowly, not quite a wave, not quite nothing, just a silent acknowledgement that the world had seen what happened. Elijah nodded back, lips pressed in a line, his coffee cooling in his palm as he scanned the sleepy neighborhood, remembering how just weeks ago this same stretch of sidewalk had been filled with chaos, sirens, and screaming. Inside, Jacob was upstairs brushing his teeth, the electric hum of the toothbrush blending with the faint sound of the news playing on the living room television. Adrian had warned him this wouldn't go away overnight, but it still caught him off guard to see their story become a headline, their pain dissected like it belonged to the public now. It didn't matter that Elijah had served his country, led men into combat, saved lives in silence. In this country, all it took was one officer, one wrong moment, one child crying out on camera, and suddenly the layers of dignity you built over a lifetime got stripped bare for the world to judge. That afternoon, the interview requests came flooding in, calls from cable anchors, podcast producers, even a few politicians who suddenly remembered they'd once shaken his hand at a veterans event, but Elijah turned them all down. "I didn't go through this for airtime," he told Adrian over the phone. "I went through this for my son." She understood, of course. She always had. "But you know they'll write the story for you if you don't tell it yourself," she said gently. "That's what they do." So Elijah chose a different path. He didn't write speeches or stage a press conference. Instead, he went to Jacob's school. It was a modest brick building tucked behind a row of maple trees with a flag that flapped stiffly in the wind and bike racks that hadn't been full in years. He walked in unannounced, asked for the principal, and sat down in the office where trophies lined the shelves like relics from a different era. Principal Saunders met him with the guarded smile of someone unsure whether to offer sympathy, support, or simply keep the peace. "Mr. Reed," she began, folding her hands, "I want to say first how sorry I am. I'm not here for apologies." Elijah interrupted, his voice steady but low. "I'm here because my son still walks these halls, and I want to know who's watching out for him when I'm not around." Saunders blinked, caught off guard, but quickly composed herself. "Of course. Jacob's safety is very important to us." "That's not what I asked," Elijah said. There was a pause, then something shifted in her posture. She leaned forward slightly, her tone quieter now. "What would you like us to do?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Teach the teachers. Talk to the kids. Don't make my boy carry the weight of this in silence. You don't have to tell them everything, but don't pretend like nothing happened." She nodded slowly, the stiffness in her shoulders easing. "We'll find a way." Outside, Jacob was waiting near the car, his backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes watching his father with that quiet blend of admiration and anxiety that had settled into him lately like a second skin. "Everything okay?" he asked as Elijah climbed in. "Yeah," Elijah said, glancing over. "I just wanted to make sure they remember who you are, not just what they saw on television." Jacob gave a small nod, then looked out the window. "I'm not sure I remember who I am either some days." The honesty in that sentence cut deeper than Elijah expected. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let it breathe between them like something sacred. "You're still you," he said finally. "You're just carrying more than most kids your age. But that doesn't mean you've changed. It just means you've seen more than you should have." That night after dinner, Elijah sat on the back porch while Jacob shot hoops in the driveway, the rhythmic thud of the ball bouncing a steady metronome in the background. The sky was streaked with orange and violet, the kind of sunset that made the whole block glow like a painting, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax his shoulders, to lean back and exhale like the air wasn't fighting him. For space. A neighbor's kid biked by and waved at Jacob, who hesitated for a moment, then waved back. It was a small thing, but Elijah saw it, the slow re-entry into boyhood, the tentative reaching out from behind the shadow cast by that terrible day. He watched as Jacob dribbled twice, squared his shoulders, and took the shot. The ball hit the rim, bounced once, and dropped through. Jacob smiled to himself, just a flicker, then turned and jogged after the ball. Elijah sipped his tea, the warmth grounding him, and thought about how many fathers never got to sit where he was sitting, how many didn't get the chance to witness healing. Not because they didn't fight for it, but because justice had arrived too late, or never arrived at all. As twilight deepened and the ball thumped slower now, Elijah rose and walked down the steps toward his son. Jacob looked up, passing him the ball. "Your turn." Elijah caught it, weighed it in his hands, and nodded. "All right." Let's see what I got." And as they moved under the dimming sky, side by side, shot by shot, the night carried something different now. Not the memory of pain, not even the satisfaction of vindication, but the quiet, steady rhythm of reclamation. A father, a son, a driveway, and a moment that for once belonged entirely to them. Some stories don't end with applause or headlines or the kind of justice that makes it onto morning shows. Some stories end in silence, earned steady and whole. Elijah didn't need the world's validation anymore. What he needed was right in front of him. His son smiling again, the air in his home no longer weighted with fear, and a future he could finally imagine shaping with his own hands, instead of bracing for with clenched fists. The house, small as it was, felt different now. Not because the walls had changed, but because the people inside them had. Every morning the sun spilled across the wooden floor like a soft promise. Every night the porch light flickered on, not out of fear, but routine. Even the creaks in the floorboards started sounding like familiar music again instead of warning signs. Life, after all, wasn't something Elijah wanted to run from anymore. It was something he was learning to step back into, inch by inch. Jacob had taken to journaling. At first it was just a few lines before bed, but now entire pages poured from him, reflections, questions, moments he couldn't say aloud. Elijah never asked to read them, never peeked. He knew some wounds closed best in the dark, without the glare of a parent's concern. But every once in a while Jacob would come downstairs with a page in hand and say, "Can I read you something?" And Elijah would stop whatever he was doing, sit back and listen with the kind of attention that didn't interrupt or fix, just received. "I don't want to be angry forever," Jacob had read one night, his voice, steady eyes on the page. "But I also don't want to forget. I want to remember what they did, but not let it become who I am." Elijah felt those words settle deep, not as a knife, but as a seed. Something new was growing in that boy, something strong and still tender. And it wasn't just survival, it was purpose. That spring they planted a tree together in the yard, a small dogwood with thin limbs and white blossoms that opened like little paper lanterns. It wasn't a grand gesture, just something Elijah had wanted to do for a while. They picked the spot together near the porch where they sat most evenings and dug slowly into the earth, hands covered in soil, the kind of quiet labor that says more than any sermon ever could. "What should we call it?" Jacob asked, squinting up at the delicate branches swaying slightly in the breeze. Elijah wiped his brow, glanced at the tree, then at his son. "Hope," he said simply. "Let's call her Hope." From then on, the tree had a name. And every few days Jacob watered it, checked its leaves, made sure no weeds were choking its roots. It became part of their rhythm, a new anchor in a life that had once felt adrift. One weekend in May, Elijah finally agreed to attend a local town forum on policing. He didn't go as a guest speaker, didn't stand behind a podium. He sat in the back row in a simple black shirt, hands clasped in his lap, and listened. He watched others speak, mothers, students, former officers, even kids not much older than Jacob, each voice carrying a piece of the story, a piece of the grief. And then, without intending to, Elijah stood up. He didn't speak for long, just a few minutes. But in that short time he said what needed saying. "My name is Elijah Reed," he began. "Some of you may know what happened to my family. Some of you may not. That's not why I'm standing here. I'm standing because my son, my beautiful, brave son, was almost taken from me by men who wore uniforms they didn't deserve to wear. And I'm still standing because he lived. Because I lived, and because that survival comes with responsibility." There was a stillness in the room as he spoke, the kind that only settles when truth finds its way into the open. He talked about silence, about the cost of staying quiet, about rebuilding not just systems but hearts. And when he sat down, no one clapped. They didn't need to. They just nodded deeply, respectfully, like something sacred had passed through. By summer, Elijah had started working with a local youth mentorship program, not for cameras or donations, but because he remembered what it felt like to be a young boy without a map. He met with kids after school, helped them build confidence, told them the truth. No one had told him when he was their age that being black and brilliant was not a contradiction. That strength didn't always come from fists or medals, but from knowing when to speak, when to forgive, and when to fight. Jacob helped sometimes too, running basketball drills, or just hanging out laughing in a way that no longer sounded guarded. His laughter had returned like birds after a long winter tentative at first, then full-throated echoing down sidewalks and upstairs. And Elijah never took it for granted. Every time he heard it, he paused, let it soak in, and gave thanks in his own quiet way. Late one evening, they sat under the stars with Adrian, who had come by to drop off some boxes of books for the mentoring center. They hadn't talked much that day, just shared a meal and some soft jazz humming from the radio. But as the night deepened and the porch light buzzed overhead, Adrian turned to Elijah and said, "You know you did it. You really did it." He looked at her, eyebrows raised. "Did what?" "You walked through fire," she said, "and you didn't come out bitter. You came out open. That's rare." He didn't respond right away, just let the breeze ruffle the edges of his shirt, the sound of crickets weaving around them like a soft net. Then he nodded slowly. "I didn't walk through it alone." And that was true. Jacob leaned against his father's side head, resting lightly on his shoulder, already half asleep. The stars above them blinked like tiny affirmations in the vastness of night, and the dogwood tree stood in quiet bloom just a few feet away, its blossoms glowing faintly in the moonlight. No more revenge, no more fear, just a father, a son, and the life they had refused to let be stolen from them, a life they had reclaimed, reimagined, and begun together. And as the porch light flickered once, then held steady, Elijah exhaled softly, letting go of the weight that had once lived in his chest, and allowed himself finally completely to rest. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in revenge, it's found in restraint. In a world that often demands we scream to be heard, this story reminds us that true power comes from knowing who you are even when others try to define you. Elijah didn't choose the spotlight, he chose his son. He chose healing, and in doing so, he taught us that justice isn't always about punishment, it's about restoration. To every parent, grandparent, and elder listening right now, remember this: your calm is powerful, your wisdom is needed, and your ability to lead by quiet example can change more than any argument ever could. We don't always get to choose what happens to us, but we do get to choose how we respond. And sometimes standing tall in the aftermath, planting roots, listening deeply, forgiving without forgetting, is the bravest act of all. So take this moment not just as a story about pain and survival, but as a call to nurture the next generation, not with fear, but with hope. And if this story moved you, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what this story means to you.